Hi, welcome to GATS 5063, Models of Church Planning. This is week 8, barriers to, or breaking growth barriers. And so, you've made it all the way to the last teaching and the last week of the 8-week course. All of you have done really great. We've looked at a lot of different subject matters, everywhere from the biblical basis of church planning to the church planner and church planning team qualities, how to recruit a team, how to strategize, how to look at the demographic in your area, how to do your church launch, how to get it up and going, how to begin to build momentum in that new church launch, structuring it for growth, etc. And so this week I want to take a look a little bit, speaking from a more of an established church plant perspective, how you can break some of the growth barriers. In particular, last week we looked a little bit about getting your church plant to that 50, 100 type of mark, and so now we're going to look at getting it beyond the 100 to the 150, 200, et cetera type growth. Now, again, all of that is assuming that the model of church planning that you're doing, I'm coming from it a little bit more of a founding pastor perspective in terms of some of the things I'm going to talk about. So if you're establishing more of an apostolic type model or missional model of church planting, where you're going in and quickly working with a group of people, establishing a church, 50 or so people, raising up leaders quickly, turning it over to them, and then going to another group or starting another church in an area or close by, that's a little bit different perspective. And so there, the emphasis isn't the initial church planter or church planting team breaking the growth barrier, but rather how quickly can we turn over and hand over this new church plant to those leaders that we've worked with in that culture, and now they're going to carry it forward while we continue other work. So it's a little different paradigm. So where I'm coming from is more from maybe a North American or developed nation perspective, where you go into an area, a church planter or a church planting team. It's more of that founding pastor type of model. Again, not that it's not apostolic, but the goal is we want to establish a strong, solid church, get it to where it's large enough that it has enough momentum that then maybe you can look at planting daughter churches, etc. But certainly you want to get it to a place where it's strong enough to be self-sustaining, and you're able to do all the functions that a church should be able to do. Obviously evangelism, discipleship, the sacraments, carrying out water baptism, the Lord's Supper, etc., children's programs, solid worship, all of leadership development training, all of those type of things. And so it takes more structure to do that. And now here's another interesting area. Depending on your paradigm, and from how the Lord is leading you, how the Holy Spirit's leading you, will also depend on the issue of buildings, and that will help grow a church or maybe hinder. Now, so let me be very careful when I say this. A lot of house church movement, and we've looked at even the simple church movement, which is another way of really discussing a house church type movement. Some of that philosophy is that we're trying to avoid the overhead of larger buildings, etc. And I agree, there's a place for that, as certainly as the Lord leads, that's number one. But also in terms of the culture and the demographic where you're at, it may not be suitable to try to obtain larger real estate. Some places the real estate's so expensive, it's just not, for a church of 50 or 100 people, for example, it's almost impossible to try to get real estate in some places. So that's understandable. So in certain applications, some of what I'm going to share with you may not come into play, especially if you're using that simple church model or more of that apostolic missionary type model, especially in developing nations. But again, in a more developed national context or North American context, sometimes a more effective strategy is that founding church model, where you are looking at whether at first maybe you're leasing a facility or renting space someplace, and now longer term you're looking at getting your own place. Maybe it's a long-term lease, maybe it's actually purchasing property. But what that does is now help aid in the growth process. Again, if that's how the Lord is leading, and that's the model that you believe He has you. I'm not saying either is right or wrong. You have to, it's what we've said from the very beginning of this course, and what you've read through the books that you've been reading, the text, as well as my lectures. There is no one size fits all. You really have to be led of the Spirit. You have to know your demographic. You have to know what God wants to do in that particular area, how He wants to do it. So that said, in some cases, growing larger is not necessarily what you should be doing. It should be staying smaller and looking at starting other churches that may be smaller in size, but raising up other leaders. So again, you just got to be led. So looking at it then from more of that founding pastor perspective and that model, let's talk about how you would break like the 100 barrier, get to 150, 200. Let's look at some of my notes here, and then I want to look at some of the reading, if we got time, that you had this week. So at this point, again, I'm assuming that the church launch has gone well. Maybe you're 6 months or a year, or maybe a year and a half, 2 years into it. You're somewhere around 100 people. You're looking to get up. Breaking that 100 barrier is a big thing. And so what's happened is, by now your church is becoming more organized. It's becoming more well known. People are hearing about your church, word of mouth. And so now you've got to begin to focus on some of the quality of what you're doing, both in terms of the worship style, the preaching style, children's ministry, the facilities. I talked a little bit about this last week. We call it first touch ministry in our church. When people come up, what does the parking lot look like? What's the sidewalk like? What's it like walking into the building? What are the greeters like? Are they warm? Are they friendly? Are they helpful? Is there good literature out front? All of those in the lobby area, all those kind of things. You want the experience for the new person coming in, whether they're an unbeliever, a seeker, or someone maybe transferring or moved, from another church, or they've come in from out of town or whatever. And so all of those are factors in the quality of the experience and that heartfelt connection that people have there initially. So as the senior pastor, you may be, especially if you're above 100 people, let's say you're around almost the 150 mark, you may be working full-time in the church now. That's a possibility. You still may be bivocational. I know many pastors where the Lord has directed them to remain bivocational so that they could have more resources to pour into the church and what the church is doing, and to be freed up in that respect. So again, as the Lord leads is the model you want. So that's a fact. Now, that said, whether you're full-time as the senior pastor or senior leader, or you're still bivocational, at this point, if you're 100, 150 people, you probably should have some type of small office space someplace that you're renting, where there's maybe a receptionist answering the phone, at least some office space where people can have a point of contact with the church. Okay, it may not be a full facility where you actually have a worship facility. It may be a 600, 800 square foot office space or something that you're renting, where it's got a place for receptionist, maybe an office for you or someone else, that type of thing. So it gives a focal point. It gives a little more legitimacy to where you are as a church. And so, again, what's happening now, Sunday mornings are becoming more and more important, better quality experience, but they're also becoming a front door of evangelism. Before this, when you were just launching the church and getting, that first 50 to 100, as I shared before, you, the pastor, and that church planting team, you were really the evangelist. A lot of it was on your shoulders, going out trying to recruit, draw new people in, reach new people. But now that you're larger, what's happening now, the momentum is beginning to shift, where a lot of the people in the church, they're excited, they're going to invite people, they tend to be a little more evangelistic, and the focal point isn't just on the small relational component of the church. Now it's becoming more of this corporate experience that people are having. You have more to offer them. Again, you want to, at all cost, you want to try to maintain and from sincerity of heart, of course, that warm, loving relational component to your church. Certainly that's what you want, no matter how large the church grows. But by now, you have more to offer them. Again, the worship experience is going to be different. The children's ministry is going to be different. The preaching, all of these type of things are going to be different. And so another dynamic is when you get to that size, the numbers of new people coming in and those that are becoming part of the church, everybody doesn't know everybody. And here's one example. When we started the church in our living room, as I've shared, as the church grew, and eventually we bought a piece of property and we continued to grow as a church and eventually built a new sanctuary, the dynamic changed significantly. So what we were able to do in the small home meetings, and certainly in the smaller church property when we first bought it, the smaller sanctuary that we had on the church property before we built the larger one, it had a different feel to it. And a couple of my leaders, they never could really transition. I mean, they understand we're larger now. Some of them are key leaders and have been in the church. But when they get up to speak sometimes, they still want to speak to this larger group of people, sometimes almost 300 people on a Sunday morning. They still want to speak, and sometimes even their mannerisms is such that it's a small home meeting. And I've had to talk to them, and as time went on, one of the leaders in particular, I've just not been able to let speak as much on Sunday morning because he just doesn't seem to have a Sunday morning understanding in a larger church context now. And he's very committed to the church. We have a good relationship, and I've talked to him a little bit about it. He's great in that smaller setting. He's not as great in that larger setting. So I say all that to say, that's a dynamic that is, as you begin to grow, you take this thing from launching the church, whether you started in the living room or grew a bunch of small groups first, and then you did the inside out, or whether you did the outside in approach, you worked with a small group of leaders and you weren't really that large, and you began to do the launch and the public meetings. You've got to work with your leaders in whichever way you go, because as you grow, there's more and more people coming in. They don't know you. They don't know everybody. Your leaders don't know everybody. So you can't just talk and act and do things as though you're just a nice large group, small group. It's just not appropriate. And again, that is a key point for a lot of churches to breaking that growth barrier. Remember, I shared, I think it was last week, something like 85% of the churches in America are 75 to 85 people. And that's another dynamic. Sometimes people just aren't able, the leader, whether the senior leader and that team, they're just not able sometimes to make that switch to a larger setting. So that's just something else to keep in mind there. And so people are coming in now to the church. So now more of the draw is they've heard about it, the worship, the preaching, whatever, the ministry, healing ministry, whatever's taking place there at your church, spirit-led ministry. So they're being drawn in by that. And so for some of these folks, the initial relationships and connectivity isn't as important. That, although we all know long-term, and I'll get into that more today, that is important. We want to get people connected, get them in small group relationship type environments. But they're coming and they're going to begin to really evaluate when they're there that first time. And some of them, they come, and some of you watching this, you know what I'm talking about. They come one time and they make a judgment one time based on how was it when I walked in the front door, where people, and they may not even consciously be thinking of all these things because it's more of a feel. How did it feel for them? Were they treated warmly, lovingly? Were they ignored? Were they, sometimes they're smothered. Sometimes it's too much, so there's a right balance there. Was the worship, did they enjoy the worship? Was it too loud? Was it too long? Was it too short? I mean, all these things, what was it like? Was it comfortable in the auditorium? Was it, did I like the pastor? I just had someone a week ago, it's an amazing little testimony. He came 2 weeks ago for the first time to our church. And at the end of worship, I gave a bunch of words of knowledge. And one of the word of knowledge for healing was sciatic condition, severe sciatic condition on the right side. So first time visitor, guy's there. It turns out he's a landscaper's name, and works a lot with his body and puts a lot of stress on his body. I found out later, and So I call out these words of knowledge, and I don't have people come forward or anything. I just call them out at the end of worship and just begin to release healing, have people stand around them to pray. So several words of knowledge, and one of them was the sciatic condition. So he comes in the following Thursday, and we have our community food bank, we have a food pantry ministry, and a lot of activity there. A lot of folks come for food. So he comes in, and he wants to help serve in the food box, him and another guy that was also at the service with him. And so he's helping serve, move boxes around, and get food for everybody and all these things. And I run into him a little bit later, and he introduces him. He says, my name's Jeff, etc. He says, I want you to know I was in the church for the first time last Sunday. I didn't even know. And he goes, you called out a word about sciatic condition. And he goes, and I kind of stood. I've had this condition for 3 or 4 years. I'm a landscaper, a lot of stress on my body. And people started praying. He goes, the minute you called that out and people laid hands on me, I felt like heat go down my side, and I instantly was healed, and all the pain is gone. And so this is fantastic, right? So he was in church now this past Sunday, so this was Sunday number 2 for him. And I was just before I got ready to do the message, I asked if he could give a testimony. He came on up, and it was really interesting. He begins to tell that story, and he says, "Yeah, I just came to check the church out." And I kind of smiled as he's sharing it. I just let him keep going. And he goes, yeah, you know how it is. You come into a new church, you want to check the church out, check the pastor out. I go, oh, check the pastor out, And then he goes, oh yeah, you want to judge the pastor, he said, and I didn't even interrupt him at that point, and you could hear people laughing all over the auditorium, and he gave his healing testimony. It was awesome, but so I thought it was really interesting. Here we are, here I am teaching this church planting class, and kind of knew what I was going to be speaking on this 8th lesson here. And that's exactly what happens so oftentimes. People are coming in, and they may not verbally tell anybody, but they are checking you, the senior pastor, out, or checking the leaders out, checking the church out, and they're making a judgment. And they're not, in most cases, not mean-spirited in any way. They just want to know if it's the right fit for them. Do I identify with the church culture here? And remember, I've said this a couple times now in some of these lectures, culture happens. You as the senior leader and the leaders that you're cultivating, you have to develop the culture that represents your DNA and what the Lord has asked you to do. Again, whether you're doing a simple church model, an apostolic missionary model, founding pastor model, whatever model you're using, that is true in all those cases. You have to define the culture and set the direction, the vision, the values, the ministry style, how you're going to do things along the way. And that's as much getting the quality and the structure in place to continue these growth barriers. Again, if your vision is to only grow churches to, let's say, 50 and turn it over to another leader and then go plant another one and raise up on some other leaders and get it to another 50, et cetera, and you want to multiply hundreds of churches, let's say, in a developing region of the world, that's a wonderful vision. But you still have to set the culture, the vision, the culture, the values along the way to develop the structure to develop the growth. I mean, whether it's one central church that you're trying to grow larger, or several or many smaller churches, to break these growth barriers, you've got to have as much of that culture in place and that structure to achieve that. So again, people are going to come in. Do I connect with the pastor? Do I enjoy listening to him preach or her preach? That's true for many people, and especially if they're not Christians or they're nominal, they're checking out the church culture, what that church body's like, what you're like. And so that's a big thing. Another big thing, and that was in a lot of your reading there, especially a great chapter with Stetzer, Im's book, Planning Missional Churches, on evangelism. I'll get to that just a little bit if we have time here at the end. Good chapter there, well worth really taking a look at that. But evangelism needs to be a big part of what you're doing, okay? And it needs to be, I want to be careful here, it needs to always be led of the Holy Spirit. And ultimately, we want to weave into the culture of our people a lifestyle of evangelism, which is both relational, getting to know people, helping to bridge the gap. There's different forms of evangelism, but certainly also moving in power evangelism, not being intimidated to pray for the sick or give a word to a person. I call it encounter evangelism. If you've taken my evangelism course here at GATS, I talk about encounter evangelism. It was my doctoral thesis is what I did. So that said, so evangelism should be woven into from the very beginning of your church plant into the culture and DNA. But now that you're larger, you're going to have to be a little more intentional in maybe organizing. Again, I hate to use the word programmatic, but you may need to be a little bit. Where you organize some outreaches, some different events where you get people kick-started to do evangelism. And by that I mean, again, you've got a lot of people coming in. The larger you get as a church, the more you get people that kind of sit on the back third of the church. You know what I'm talking about? It's the 80-20 rule. You get 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. And so the larger you get, that dynamic comes into play more. So the more that you can try to get those who are on the fringe that have started coming, and you want them to come, you want to get them to where they're growing strong as disciples, some types of evangelism effort and dedicated times will help do that. So again, we want evangelism to happen naturally as part of our church culture and more organically. But now, again, we're getting enough people that you must be very intentional about reaching and bringing new people into the church and helping those that are there now getting involved in it. And so, and you can't do it yourself anymore. The core team or the church planning team can't do it all. You've got to help put this into the life and the discipleship model that you've started at your church. All right, so another big thing that you're going to need to be doing is leadership development, as well as developing your leaders to help you pastor and minister to the people that are in the church. So the goal is, again, part of the reason many churches only get to 75 or 85 people, that's about the size that a pastor or a husband-wife team can effectively pastor that many people. They can, 50, 75 or so people, husband and wife team can pastor that many people, although it can really wear them out, and I don't encourage that at all. But as you get certainly up above that 75, 100, 125 mark, you're up to that size, there is no way that you can effectively pastor all those people. So you've got to develop leaders where they understand and they're helping shoulder some of that load of meeting with people, developing, ministering to the needs of the people. Now, I'm not saying that your office isn't open, especially if you're full-time, for counseling and meeting with people. No, you do that. But again, some of what needs to take place is you've got to be able to delegate some of this with other leaders. And so developing leaders, it's crucial at this point. You're starting to approach the point where infrastructure is everything. And so a lack of infrastructure and leaders will keep you from growing or leave you just simply with a large crowd on Sunday morning. So you'd be very shallow in the depth of the people that are coming to your church. So you've got to be intentional about developing leaders. As I've said before, you want to develop leaders, you want to disciple leaders who will be able to develop or disciple others. And we mentioned this in last week's lesson, 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul talks about 4 generations of discipleship that's taking place there, or leadership development. It was number 1, Paul, to number 2, Timothy, to number 3, faithful people, to number 4, those that are able to teach others. And so you want to be working with not just one generation of leaders, but thinking down the line, 3-4 generations of leaders. How can we develop them to be developing other people, disciples who are making disciples? And very, very important. So that has to be revisited when you're looking at how do we establish and grow beyond where we're at. Again, no matter what church model you're using, whether you're using that simple church model or you're using a founder, pastor model or apostolic model, whatever model, that has to be integral to what you're doing. You want to look for a number 2 person. I'm very grateful about, I guess it was about 3 years into the church plant, my number 2 person came along who happened to also still be our worship pastor. And he's been working with me since 2006. We planted the church in 2002. Glenn, a wonderful brother, we're good friends. He's been working with me since they came to church in the fall of 2005, so about 3 years into the church plant. We'd already purchased a church property. We had a worship leader before him. They, for various reasons, him and his family decided to move out of state. And so just before he left, we were, praying about, the next worship leader, and Glenn showed up. And as it turns out, he had been a worship leader in a couple of other churches through the years. He's just a couple years younger than I am, and and so the next few months unfolded. We got to know him. He was part of the worship team, and then when the other transition happened to the worship leader, we prayed about it, felt to offer that position to him. He stepped in, and so, which was a key position, in a church like ours and our values and where we are. Worship is a big piece of it, and so he's done a great job. And then as time went on, we took a step of faith. I shared a little bit last week about hiring a church secretary who was already there before, he came on. And then he was just kind of working in a volunteer capacity at first as a worship pastor. And then the Lord began to prompt me to extend an invitation to him to work on staff, a paid position. And that was a huge step of faith for us. And we extended that to him. And he did great. And then as time went on, we extended not just a worship pastor, but an assistant pastor role, and he's helped in that way. And as is the case of many small church plants, you need to be obviously led of the Spirit every step of the way. And you may need to take a step of faith in hiring someone before the finances you really feel comfortable are there. And this was the case with Glenn. But you also need to be looking for people, and the Spirit will guide you, that are multifaceted. They're able to do several things well. Glenn and I, of course, my wife and I, and now Glenn, and of course I have another key assistant who's operation manager now since. All of us are able to do many things really well, 5 or 6 things. You have to. You just don't have the luxury in a smaller church to have, someone on staff where they only do 1 or 2 things. I mean, generally they've got to do 3 or 4 things. Now that may mean they have 1 or 2 things they specifically focus on, but do other things. So, for example, with Glenn, I was responsible for developing the first website at our church before he ever came, even visited our church. And then by the time he got there, I had actually contracted out to someone else to develop the second generation website for our church. So then when Glenn came on staff, he not only had worship leader responsibilities, he was really good at repairing things, again, building maintenance, and he actually likes that. Less now as time has gone on, but at first he really enjoyed that. But I also gave him the website responsibility, so he began to transition on that. And then him and I together developed the third generation website, and now here we are years later, and we're actually developing a 4th generation website, and he's taking the lead. And so I'm just giving some input, but now and so it's been a wonderful symbiotic relationship there. And so you really want to begin early on to look for the right person that can come alongside as your number 2 person. Now, I don't consider my wife number 2 because her and I kind of we co-pastor the church together. So that's an important piece of it there. Keep in mind, community awareness continues to be important. Unless you're in a small town where you're maybe really well known, you're going to have to continue to do some things to be noticed in a larger metropolitan area. So you want to keep that in mind. And so on that note, now I just mentioned, working on our 4th generation website. We're 17 years as a church. You need to constantly be looking at what's your website like. Is it relevant? Is it current? There are new designs and models of website that come out every 3, 4, 5 years. And so you want to stay current on that. Is it mobile friendly? Is it adapted to a mobile device? Most people are looking on the internet through smartphones now. So those kind of things. Church apps. So all of those kind of things, as I've talked about all along, You want to really be working on the brochures, your vision statements. You want to have all those type of things well in place. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here on this one, but I want to mention it. Church splits. Once you get large enough, the risk of a church split becomes greater. And sometimes it's somebody that's feel they can do a better job than you, or some of the leaders, that type of thing. It's painful. Some of you have commented, through this course to some of what you've gone through, and I've gone through it. You've just got to be very, very aware of it. You've got to use a lot of wisdom, discernment, through the process. But again, if you're working closely with your leaders and you have good relationship with them, and you've got a good rapport, and you're not just putting people in place that don't share your heart, your values, who don't see you as their pastor, they see you as your pastor, respect your leadership, then you're on a much safer footing to not have someone, betray you or cause a church split. And obviously we see with Jesus, he had 12 disciples, 12 closest disciples, apostles, and of course Judas betrayed him. So the reality is that betrayal can happen even with those that are most closest to us. So you can't totally minimize everything, but the more proactive you can be in spending time with your leadership team, developing relationship, developing shared values, being sensitive to their heartfelt needs and their suggestions, ideas, working together in dynamic dialogue when it comes to certain decisions at the church, then that's going to minimize, we're all going to, no matter what team you build, there's at times going to be disagreements, different ways to see things. And so you've got to not be rigidly righteous where you try to be so strict or so structured in how you're leading that you don't give some of these other ones some opportunity to give input and direction, or give them, because that's important. Because if people get dissatisfied and frustrated, that's when they're more likely to create a problem or split, and you want to try to avoid that. So enough on that. Some other thoughts here. All right, let's talk about facilities a little bit more. So that's another key point. They talk about the 80-20 rule when it comes to a facility. Again, I'm looking at more of a larger church context where you've got a facility. So the general rule of thumb is when you get to 80% capacity. So if you've got a facility where you've got 100 chairs, if you've got 80 people that are consistently coming on Sunday morning, you've basically outgrown that space. Here's the dynamic. Now, I shared a few weeks ago about how we felt a year ago to go to a second service. The general rule of thumb is you don't want to try to go to a second service until you're at least 200 people, and I would say probably more like 250, 300. Because when you go to a second service, the size of your larger service now is going to get smaller, and you don't want it to get so small that you lose momentum. Because what will happen is if you lose momentum in that main Sunday morning service, let's say, and now Sunday evening service or second Sunday service or Saturday night service like we tried, you're going to be struggling to have enough leaders there and enough folks there to have that momentum in that new service, and you don't want the core service that had a lot of momentum all of a sudden to not have momentum. So you really need to use a lot of wisdom if you're using that model, more of the founding pastor model, and you're trying to grow that church beyond 100 people or so. You want to get it to 300, etc. You want to have enough momentum before you get a second service. So if the current space that you're leasing or renting is, only seats about 100 and you're already 80 or so people, you need a larger facility. So you either need to begin to look for a larger facility you can rent or lease, or you may want to consider the possibility of buying a place. But that's got a lot of risk, and all I can tell you there on that is pray, 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 be led of the Holy Spirit. How the Holy Spirit led us is dramatically unconventional. We were 2 years old. I think I've shared this story already. We were 2 years old and had about 30 people in the church, and the Lord began to speak to us about buying a piece of property. And I was struggling with the whole reality that here we are 2 years into the church plant. We're only really 30 or so people. I had expected by then that we would be 100 plus people, and it just simply didn't happen. And it was a big risk to move forward, but the Lord made it very clear. We moved forward on buying the church property. It was really miraculous how it all happened. And lo and behold, no sooner than we got into that church, within months, we were almost up to 100 people. There was something about having that piece of church property, even though the sanctuary was small and the buildings were older, it just made a huge difference in our community in terms of how people viewed us. They generally didn't view us as being legitimate when we were meeting in the hotel. That was primarily, and we also met, as I shared, for 9 months in a dirt lot. But a lot of those folks that were coming were homeless and poor, and a lot of those, we ministered to love them, but they didn't come with us when we moved into the building. It was too structured for them. It was really interesting. But a lot of folks just didn't see us as being legitimate until we actually had our own piece of church property. So again, you've got to know your area. You've got to know how the Lord is leading you. There is just simply, I know one pastor in town. He's got a very successful church. It would be considered a mega church, a couple thousand people. They've opened 2 different campuses, and they have only looked at old shopping centers. That's how they feel the Lord wanted them to do it. So they've purchased old shopping centers, renovated those, and then opened up the first campus and then the second campus and another one. So again, there's just no one size fits all in how to do it. Now, I do know that in this area, I've watched those that have tried to use, in the Tucson, Arizona area, tried to use the simple church model, house church model. I have not seen that model successful in this area. There's something in the psychology of people who do want to go to church, that they want a building. They want a place that they can go to. Now, we know the church isn't the building, but the reality is that's how many people look at it. So you want to be thinking about, if you want to grow, you have to realistically look at buildings. It's a big part of it. How much parking space do you have? What type of classrooms, nursery space do you have? Sunday school classrooms do you have, etc.? All of these are very, very important. So you may want to begin to start saving 5-10% of your income, put in some type of building fund or whatever, if again, how the Lord leads. So as I wrap up with some of my notes here, so you want to continue to emphasize these 3 big things through this trying to break this barrier and get the church really growing. You want to continue to evangelize. Number 1, evangelism. Emphasize evangelism, gathering people, getting them in. Number 2, connecting people, building that sense of community. So that's discipleship. So that's a big thing. So you got evangelism, you've got connection, and then number 3, development, and that would be developing new leaders. So evangelism, connection, development. You've got to continually to look at those, because again, as I shared earlier in this lecture, if you're not developing new leaders and generations of new leaders, you're going to be trying to shoulder way too much than you should be shouldering, and you're not delegating enough so that they can help minister the needs of the people and do some of the other activities of the church, so you can be freed up to do some more of what you're to do. But the church just simply won't maintain the growth and the momentum without other leaders raised up. But you also have to have that sense of community for all the people, leaders and non-leaders alike, to get discipleship, develop community, and then evangelism is another piece of that. Now, one thing, let me just say, add a couple more thoughts on building. I forgot, I had some more notes right here. So in terms of your building size, so if you're not at a place that you can afford, let's say, to move into that larger facility. So let's say you find a place now that can maybe seat 200 or 300 people, and you're currently in a place that can seat 100. Let's say you're not quite ready to be able to afford that or sign that lease, whatever the case may be. One of the things you can do, in our church, for example, we keep the kids in our worship, and that's a part of our value. However, and that might be part of your value. So one of the things that you could do is now during the worship, since you're already 80 plus in that 100 seat area that you've got, maybe now you begin to move the children into their own type of worship service, so it frees up some seats, frees up some space, just as a temporary thing till you get to that larger facility. And so that's one thing that you could do. Number 2, You could maybe look at, smaller aisles, smaller distance between the seats. I'm not advocating airline type seating where you're so cramped, that person can't stand and try to worship from their seat. But you may have to be creative on some of those type of things. And some of the issue when you have a smaller place like that is the parking, especially if you're leasing some type of storefront, or if it's a school, you might be better off. But so you've got to look at the parking there. Another thing you can do is you can encourage people, hey, let's call it the Keep It Cozy campaign or whatever, where you're encouraging people to squeeze in a little bit, don't leave empty seats between them. Again, especially in North American culture, people like their space, but it might be one thing you could do to help before you're able to move into that larger facility that you could afford. So those are most of my notes. I want to touch on those first because you had a lot of reading this last week, but some good reading. So first we'll take a look at Stetzer M. Planning Missional Churches. Chapter 20 on evangelism I thought was really good. Some very good insights there. So it would behoove you, I know the course is wrapping up, but to really go through this reading material and at least become familiar enough with it that you can go back and revisit it if you find yourself church planting or expanding your church planting models. So very clearly says, develop a plan for intentional evangelism, page 239. It's crucial. In fact, it's easier to start a church by drawing Christians from other churches than to win new disciples from the community. And so they're really coming at it from, look, we're not just trying to grow a church by church transfer, but by reaching new disciples. So that's their focus there. So some very good stuff. Talks about intentionality and some different scales. Use that how you feel best. But on page 246, sharing the gospel story, I thought this was very interesting reading and informative. Basically, they make the argument that every person, first of all, undergoes a process of movement towards Christ before actually converting to Christ. And so we've got to be cognizant of that. And then they go on to begin to talk about literate learners versus non-literate learners, essentially. And they make a quote here on page 247. Grant Lovejoy reports that only 20% of the people in the world are literate learners. The rest, 5.7 billion, are what is known as oral learners, or is probably a more polite way to say it than non-literate. And so what that basically means is abstract types of communication do not penetrate their hearts. Narrative, on the other hand, does. In other words, they want stories. And so it's important for them to hear stories to help weave the narrative. And they go down to talk about how some now have adopted in church planting movements the creation to Christ, or C2C type model, where basically they tell the gospel story from creation to Christ in a narrative story form to make it more palatable to the 80% of the world's population that are really oral learners. So I thought that was very, very interesting. You want to probably think about that in your church context. Again, whether you're here in North America or a developed nation, or you're in a developing world in church planting, those are some very important things. They then talk about on page 248 gospel proclamation versus gospel demonstration. And so basically telling about the gospel versus demonstrating the gospel. Keep in mind, they're evangelical, so they're not really their demonstration of the gospel is doing acts of charity, service, that type of things, which certainly we should do. Some of our church growth has been largely because of our big outreach to the poor through a food box ministry that we do at our church, because we're centrally located in town. We get a lot of people that come. And so it's created, we've touched a heartfelt need in the community, as well as a lot of our church people have become more involved, and it creates a dynamic for them where this is something a lot of people want to really serve in. But they don't really mention power evangelism, or what I call encounter evangelism, where people encounter the love and the power of Christ, and so moving in the gifts of the Spirit, that type of thing. So again, really worth taking a look at there, the chapter on evangelism. And then they get into chapter 21, small groups, and again, that's that connection component. Remember, evangelism, connection, and development. You want to be reaching, gathering people. You want to be connecting them. You want to be discipling them. And then thirdly, you want to be developing, equipping people, all your people, but developing leaders especially. So the small group discussion there is well worth you taking a look at. And then, of course, they get into other things such as worship, chapter 22, then preaching, chapter 23. So there might be some things there that are helpful, and spiritual formation, which really ties back in with discipleship. And then chapter 25 I thought was good on children. And so, again, that's part there. And then the Ott Wilson book, chapter 14, had you kind of go back in time here a little bit. I thought there was some good material there on reproducing, strengthening, and sending. Now, again, this is sort of looking at it from more of a missionary, apostolic missionary type model, but it's good. In fact, they used the Acts 13, the Antioch church model there, and they start out here on page 287 of chapter 14. Reproduction begins by teaching new believers how to share their faith, teaching disciples how to disciple others, teaching leaders how to train up new disciples and other leaders, and reproducing cells or small groups as the spiritual building blocks of the church. So very, very good material in this chapter there that will help solidify. Now, he then talks about, again, he's sort of advocating more of a simple church type model, I think, than maybe the founding pastor type model. Again, we hold all this loosely. There's some good material here, but he really talks about being willing on page 289. Growth is measured by the capacity to release, not retain. I agree with what they're saying. Very, very important. But if the Lord has led you to do more of a founding pastor model in an urban area, especially here in North America, if you try to multiply too quickly, you could actually kill the church plant. Remember, some statistics that I've read over the years say it takes 20 years in a North American context to establish a new church plant. So if you try to move too quickly at releasing people to multiply other churches, you actually may hinder what you're doing. So again, some good material here to make a good argument based on the Antioch church model we see in Acts 13. You just need to be led of the Spirit in all things, and know your demographic, know what the Lord's called you to, know what He's asking you to do, and just be obedient to that. And then in chapter 19, so some good stuff there. Chapter 19 of Ott Wilson, Planning Churches with Kingdom Impact. Very, very good. The first couple of pages here does an excellent job at the narrative of what the kingdom of God, what our mission is, and what real kingdom impact is. And then so he talks about three dimensions, and this is all related to planting churches with kingdom impact, but that will have growth. These three dimensions, the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, and the Great Calling, constitute the fullness of what it means to be the church, the people of God's choosing, a kingdom community, and some very, very good stuff. So they are looking at then some very practical things that we can do to help bring transformation in our communities, no matter where we are worldwide, and some very excellent material there. And so that's all I have here for week 8. I've really enjoyed lecturing with you during these 8 weeks. Models of church planning, some good material. I've learned some new things along the way, learned some new things from all of you as well. And that's the nature of the kingdom of God. And we never stop learning, we just keep growing. And so I think very much, as we've talked from week 1, church planning certainly, while not explicitly stated in the Great Commission, it is intrinsic to the Great Commission and certainly the Great Commandment as well, into loving people and bringing the good news of Jesus Christ and helping people come into that reality of God's love and the kingdom of God. And so church planning is one of the most effective ways to effectively evangelize and disciple the nations. And so, many of you, I think, are really beginning to see that. And I just sincerely pray that God will lead you and that you'll be very, very effective in the ministries and the calling that He has in your life both with the church context you're in now, the ministry context, and where he's leading you to. God bless.